Now, the AG says he's been briefed on the investigation into the March death of a young girl in Stanley, which led to murder charges filed against her foster parents. Prosecutors charging 62-year-old Raymond Johnson and 44-year-old Jamie Johnson with murder, child abuse, and domestic violence in the girl's death. They were arrested Friday in Stanley. In court records, investigators say a 3-year-old girl with autism who was in their care died in March. A BCI investigator said ring footage inside the house showed the Johnsons striking or kicking the girl, and a preliminary autopsy shows she died of blunt force trauma. Wrigley said he was briefed on it earlier today by the BCI.
A very, very troubling circumstance, even on the face of what's become public so far, and can assure people that law enforcement is fully engaged in pursuing that investigation to the ultimate.
The Johnsons remain in custody, each held on $1 million bond. They'll be back in court in late July. We've also reached out to Health and Human Services for more information.